Eric Leidersdorf, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
No, thank you very much. And I must say, got to thank Luke Story for the introduction. There's always an introduction behind every guest. And when it's as solid as what Luke provided, I need to say thank you. So I really appreciate you coming on, mate.
Of course, as much as it pains me to thank Luke as well, I will do so. So thanks to both you guys. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here. You've had some great guests to this point, and I'm looking forward to sullying that reputation.
No, absolutely. Anyone doesn't know who you are, Eric, would you mind just giving us a bit of a background on you, what you're doing now, what you've done previously? Because you got a bit of a different background than a traditional, let me say.
Sure. I'm currently the director of biomechanics at P3. So we're based out of Santa Barbara, California. We've got a couple of facilities, one in Atlanta, Georgia as well, which is where I am now. But I've been at P3 for about 10 and a half years at this point. Over the course of that time, I've really worked with our biomechanics team to kind of oversee our assessment process, going through everything from data collection, acquisition, on through any ultimate analytics projects that we run. So in school, I studied biomechanical engineering as an undergraduate, master's in applied analytics. So we're getting a little more stats heavy with some of the work that we're doing. But having been at P3 for that decade plus. A lot of my time spent, working in basketball, American football, world football, baseball, number of sports that we're, have the good fortune to work with.
Super interesting. So, I mean, was it I'm guessing obviously it wasn't a traditional pathway into the role you are now, but was getting involved in sport always something that was a passion of yours from the biomechanical engineering? You still thought that the path may lead to sport, or not at all?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up just loving sport, right, and playing every sport. Never at a high level, but grew up loving it. Always had some kind of aptitude for math or physics in that direction as well. But I'd say biomechanics is something that I really sort of stumbled across. I think I initially went to university with thoughts of being any other type of engineer, frankly, and between switching majors more than a handful of times between pre-med and electrical engineering, sort of found my way after a couple of winding years to the biomechanics track, and I think P3, when I ultimately found my way there, I think it was a great kind of opportunity for me to apply a lot of what I'd learned in undergrad, as a biomechanics student. But there were some really impressive tools at this private facility, and they had some really impressive athletes who were I was fortunate to use to be able to study a lot of things that we'd learned about in school. So it was a great opportunity, and I was very fortunate to kind of stumble upon that role.
In the US, in sports like basketball, like baseball, are specific biomechanics roles becoming more popular, whether employing someone directly for that area?
Yeah, I think so. So particularly in a sport like baseball, I know that they're at the highest level in Major League Baseball, I'd say every team or close to it has at least one kind of biomechanics staff member as a part of their sports science team or performance team. And in other sports, I think it's becoming increasingly more popular. But in baseball, especially as it's really sort of gravitated towards a more analytics-centric approach to the game, it's become a much more popular position.
It's becoming cool. Dare I say biomechanics is becoming cool?
You might, but you might be the only one at this point. Yeah.
Nice, mate. Right. Let's dive into the stuff that you do on a day-to-day basis, or P3 do on a day-to-day basis, and that's around jumping, jump testing, jump training, etc.
Sure.
with some of the athletes that you work with. And one thing that I want to drag it right back, we're talking a lot about jump testing, and I spoke to Jason Lake 4 or 5 years ago on this as well, and he's like, there's all this jump testing going on, but why do we pick the jump to then infer things from different dynamic actions, etc. So I'm going to bring that back to you. Why do we assess jumps, and what's the basis that gives us?
It's a great question, and I think the answer depends a bit depending on the sport that you're working with. So there are certain sports like basketball, like volleyball, very jumping intensive sports where maybe there are some pretty straightforward links between the jumps that you'll study on force plates or with motion capture and ultimately certain strategies or things that are used on court. But for other sports, right, the footballs, the baseballs of the world, I think when we use jump testing, we're using it more generally to assess physical qualities that have implications with respect to training. So certain work that we can do in the weight room or on the pitch that ultimately is going to relate to, back to some qualities that are going to be beneficial for the athlete. So in certain respects, and frankly, the sports that we work most closely with, which is basketball at P3, there are some very direct or almost, linear links between jump testing that we can do and some, leaps that we can make to outcomes that occur on court. But for certain other sports, I think it's important to know that we're dealing with a slightly abstracted view of what that jump testing tells us. Force production at various phases of the movement, that will have some implication, down the road to some work we can do in a training environment.
Would I be way off in thinking, this is maybe my skepticism, but would I be way off in thinking that people just take it as given that jump testing is the way to go to make those linear links to other performance outcomes?
I mean, I think that's fair. I think it's fair just because it's been so commonplace, right? Sometimes I think we confuse gold standard for just most common. And jumps are relatively easy to study, right? When you talk or when we think about, particularly different force plate technologies that have become much more ubiquitous in the past, 5 years, last 5 to 10 years, give or take. I think the ability to study jumps has become much easier, or much more accessible, I guess is maybe a better way to put it. And from that, when people have information, they're going to try and understand it. And that's where some of those links start to be made. But I think a lot of that just has to do with kind of the ease of kind of data collection, I suppose, which has improved considerably. I think to some extent we saw a similar trend when it comes to load monitoring or GPS tracking. As that becomes more popular, I think the line between gold standard and very common, starts to get blurred a little bit.
Which leads me on to my next question. And what solid-ish links can we make between metrics that we can collect on a force plate, for example, and things that happen on court or on field?
I think the answer is it depends to some extent, right? And a lot of it depends on how certain you are in some of those findings. When it comes to, I would say, generally speaking, there's been a lot of research applied to linking, jumping or jump strategies to kind of accelerative properties, right? When we think about more linear sprinting, I think, there have been kind of a number of papers sort of linking those two outcomes, I suppose. And Damian Harper as well as, kind of brought deceleration to the forefront, or, especially starting to popularize it a bit more as well. And I think there are certainly some links between certain jump measures and decelerative ability here too. So I think there's certainly some degree of certainty that you can probably apply to, non-jumping actions that you can get a fingerprint on or sort of link back to some jump outcomes. But you're always going to get a bit more granularity if you study the movement itself, probably, assuming the technology is in a place where you can get good data on it.
And that's probably where the interesting discussion comes with deceleration, because I was speaking to Damian and a few others last week or the week before around the technology available to assess deceleration and how hard that actually is, because there's so many moving parts, and how you actually standardize it, the tests available, et cetera, which maybe links back to why people are trying to use jumping and force plates to try to infer deceleration qualities. If you're trying to do that, what kind of metrics are we actually interested in when it comes to that link?
Sorry. When it comes to links between the kind of jump or counter movement jump studies to decelerative properties?
Exactly.
Yeah. Good question. And it's one that I think we're hoping to shed a bit more light on here moving forward. We're actually using or kind of adapting some of Damian's work and studying some kind of ADA principles in our basketball athletes in P3, again, much shorter court than, some of the other sports as well. So the distances are going to be a little bit different, but Jake Roush, who's a member of our team, is going to, use this project, for for his PhD process. So it's something we've been piloting, I'd say, for about the past 18 months. And right now, I don't think right now we're not confident linking too many metrics from jump variables or jump-based variables to this decelerative property. Yeah. But I think the concept itself is really strong and one that warrants fleshing out, which is why we're going to pursue it, right? Understanding how some of these jump parameters are just, more simpler, more attainable, lab-based measures relate to maybe a more field-based test like the ADA. And ultimately where we'd like to take this one is kind of understanding how those same accelerative or decelerative metrics relate to on-court principles as well. So, accelerometer or kind of gyroscope data collected from athletes going through drills that start to stress these, these abrupt changes of direction as well, is really where we want to, start to understand these links. Because right now, I would say for the work that we've done internally, our most interesting examples kind of live with the outliers, right? They live with the guys who sort of well exceed the norm. But when it comes to understanding the property as a whole, I don't know that that's something we have really clear insight on yet.
Yeah. One thing that I think is really exciting, and just going through your Twitter feed like I do before I speak to, P3's Twitter feed.
I was going to say, hopefully not mine, because there's not much there.
Yeah. Well, I went through, I had a little look at yours, and P3 led me to P3. And then just even going back 3-4 years, looking at some of the internal work that's been going on and you sharing them, I think as a private organization, that's really exciting because you have the ability to do that and to kind of open the door on what you do. And it always excites me, especially with the podcast, but with the articles, when people have done internal studies and gone, this is what we found, this is on our cohort, it's not going to go in a published journal ever, but we're happy to talk about it on either a podcast or an article. For me, that is absolute gold. And that's the kind of thing that you are doing daily, with you and your staff. Yeah. Well,
sure. Well, I appreciate it. And on behalf of P3, we appreciate that sentiment. I think, again, being in the private sector, I think it's important for us to show some degree of, or, not some degree, hopefully show kind of, as much transparency as we can with respect to the numbers that we collect and the implications of, that data for training outcomes or for just general decision-making. And I think, it's something that's, kind of important quality for P3 to carry moving forward. We do have a goal moving ahead as well to start putting some of our more, what we think of as foundational findings in literature as well. So we are kind of trying to tiptoe through the publication process, but I think we've been able, we've been very fortunate to learn some really interesting things by asking good questions. And ultimately we want to start to, we want to share them. It doesn't do us a whole lot of good to just sit on them.
Of course. I mean, I know how protective organizations are about the data that gets shared. Because you're coaching and testing athletes that aren't yours, unlike an organization has a contract with an athlete, how difficult is that for you to share those kind of things as a private organization?
I guess it depends. So in certain instances, a lot of it, like anything else, is relationship driven, right? So if there's good transparency, particularly between the organization and the athlete, which isn't always the case, that makes things much simpler, right? But there are certainly instances where, we have to make sure we can work to effectively communicate the things that we've found to the athlete or to their support staff, whether that's personally, for their kind of off-season support staff, or with the team that they're a part of. So we do our best. It's certainly not a one size fits all approach when it comes to that sort of thing.
Of course. Just moving on to the assessment tools that we have available to us. Obviously, we many of us and the people listening have used a Just Jump mat and then moved on to, Pasco force plates at a reasonable price, and then onto the more Hawking Dynamics, etc. But now we've got things like markerless motion capture, which I spoke to, like I mentioned to before, speaking to people in the NFL, because they've been given like a diary system.
Yes. Yeah.
So you've got systems like that. How reliable? I mean, just going on the markerless systems, where are we at with understanding what they can do what they can give us reliability wise, etc.?
We're getting there.
Okay.
So I think we've used CME motion capture system for the past 10 or so years, give or take.
Yeah.
And so we've run a number of kind of validation studies looking at our more traditional marker-based approach to the markerless system, with CME, and also some competitors too. And I think the short answer is right now I would say the marker-based model is generally a bit more reliable when it comes to looking at some of these more granular measures of biomechanics, but there are certainly some real logistical benefits to a marker-based system when it comes to post-processing time, which almost doesn't exist or can be shortened considerably relative to a marker-based system. And then especially in a team environment where time is of the essence. And at P3, we're fortunate to have a great staff of biomecs to help crunch the numbers. Whereas if you can get a system to do that for you, it certainly saves you some kind of some logistical headache in that sense. So in general, I think it's getting there, and we've seen kind of notable improvements in markerless motion capture capabilities. But you're certainly not quite hitting the same gold standard, I think, that you're getting from from a marker-based motion capture system, or at least one that we've been kind of accustomed to working with. I guess going back to our conversation at the start, right, is more common golden standard. Where's the line between those two? Yeah. So in general, I'd be surprised if we didn't see continued improvements with respect to markerless motion capture. I think it's I think it's certainly coming. And at some point we're going to have to make a choice between, and we're just going to have to make a decision on how good is good enough. And when markerless get to a point where it's good enough, I think it's going to make sense to jump into that with 2 feet.
What's the price implications for markerless versus marker systems? General ballpark.
Good question. I don't know. Okay. All right. I guess I don't know well. Yeah,
no, it's fine, mate.
There are markerless systems that kind of run the gamut, right? You can have, even some groups are trying to use the iPhone, 1 or 2 to try and capture, some of these measures, and others are, like we use a 8-camera marker-based motion capture setup. That's, again, just more traditional lab-based system. As far as the price differences are concerned, I'm not certain, but that is something I should probably figure out. I'll report back.
No, that's fine. Yeah. I was just seeing if you knew, but that's absolutely no problem. I'm going to ask you a big question now, and anyone that's discussing, anyone that I've had on who's discussing false plates and jump training, jump testing, etc. What metrics actually matter? Because any system that you're going to get, you're going to be like I suppose similar to a GPS system. You're going to be throwing lots of different metrics. Yes, some may be displayed on a particular dashboard that make it easy for the user and try to simplify things. But at the end of the day, you're going to have lots of options. Yeah. So what options actually matter?
The unfortunate answer is probably that it depends. Kind of depends what matters to you, right? So if you're a coach, and if you're a sport coach and something matters to you, it's probably my role or anyone's role as a sports science practitioner to find some measures that reliably, repeatedly assess what that quality is, and course correct or inform as needed. But I think the short answer is probably that it depends on what quality we're discussing, right? So when we think about our traditional kind of vertical plane indicators, right, when we're talking about a counter movement jump or a depth jump or squat jump, anything along those lines, I think what we've seen based on sort of our studies that we've run in-house, one that we published, is that there are a series of force time curve measures and motion capture markers that are generally important for athletes who want to improve their vertical displacement, if that's something that matters to you. But we also spend a lot of our time studying movement in the lateral plane, particularly in basketball, where a lot of defensive actions occur side to side. And kind of those performance determining factors are, a completely different set than the ones, than the factors that drive you vertically. And so I think depending on the qualities that we're trying to study or improve for, help improve for an athlete, the metrics that matter, are a bit variable themselves.
Mm-hmm. So vertical displacement, want to get people jumping higher. If that's the aim, are there any particular metrics, like you mentioned about the study, that you would gravitate towards or encourage people to gravitate towards?
Sure. I guess the first thing I would encourage is, generally study the athletes that you're working with. I think that's research is fantastic and has it really has a place in our landscape. But for the athletes that you're working with, I think it's important to study them because they're going to be a unique subset relative to the population at large, I suppose. There are some classic Newtonian physics that influence us all that are probably worth combating. But in the paper that you're referencing, where we were really looking at different kind of like we'll call them eccentric phase strategies, and how ultimately how those related to jump performance in an NBA population. And we broke out these different sets of clusters or groups or types of mover. Ultimately, we saw that they all had a few shared characteristics, regardless of how that jump was executed, right? So we have some athletes who love going through range. We have some athletes who absolutely despise it, and we have some athletes, who really only go through any range at the hip, right? And so depending on those three groups, I think what we saw from that research was there are still kind of a core set of 4 factors that drive vertical displacement for all of them. That was relative concentric force output. It was knee extension velocity and acceleration, and then just generally being shorter. I think not that we can change that much, but general height played a role in there as well. But those factors, regardless of the jump style, tended to impact vertical displacement when we look at it through some some linear regression models that we ran. But there are also some kind of secondary factors for all these groups that if you're really trying to tune or optimize performance for an athlete in that group, those may warrant a little more attention at that point. But those 4, I'd say, were the big ones that we found from that study.
Just remind us of the 4 again.
The 4, so knee extension velocity and acceleration, concentric force or relative concentric force output, so force generated during the concentric phase relative to mass, and then height as well. So generally, shorter athletes are jumping higher.
Yeah. So that's combining some of the motion capture data and the force plate data.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So for that one, we were looking at kind of a full set of kinetic and kinematic measures from both force plates and motion capture that, essentially that would help us identify or look at, jump displacements across a few different styles, in our population. So
for the lateral aspect, you said was obviously important from a basketball for a basketball athlete.
Sure.
Anything different there?
Yes. Yeah. So I think the short version, right, is if we see, generally kind of an emphasis on variables across the knee, right, for vertical movements, right, the knee extension velocity or knee extension acceleration, a lot of measures that we're seeing impact lateral plane movement, whether that's lateral acceleration or performance in like a change of direction environment. We're seeing a lot more variables pop up around the hip, right? So generally having a well-functioning hip joint tends to be a really important quality here. Hip extension velocity, hip abduction, just simply range in that sense. These are factors that tend to drive athletes side to side, or at least our most effective lateral plane athletes side to side. And so, I think it's just interesting, right? When you start to think about maybe how versatile a force plate or a force plate in motion capture can be, you're going to deal with different sets of kind of performance parameters depending on what the quality is that you're trying to assess in that sense.
Yeah. How much does limb length and segment differs? How does that affect things?
I mean, it definitely does, especially when you deal with guys like we see who are humongous. They're by and large, they're big. And so it certainly plays a role. And so I think, in the same premise that I would encourage to study the athletes that you're working with, when we're looking at guys, I think as our sample size gets bigger, you have the luxury of kind of whittling down or, kind of like, I would say, narrowing the scope of athletes that you can use within each individual cohort. And so in basketball, right, rather than just looking at, all athletes that we've assessed, right, all 800 guys who play in the NBA, we're just going to look at guys who play, in the 4 or 5, right, generally our bigger athletes, or we're going to look at our wing players or our guards. So you can, the more that you can start to I suppose, narrow the scope, right, of the athletes that you're looking at, and maybe get a bit more like for like comparisons. That tends to account for some of those limb length discrepancies, because we have guys who differ by more than a foot in height playing in the NBA, and that's just reality.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of, obviously, that you're working with basketball players whose job is to jump. Like that's what they do, in various different means, various different ways. But obviously, when I'm playing football as a central defender, or used to tried to play football as a central defender, my job was to jump and head it, and obviously win the ball in the air, which didn't happen as much as the basketball jumps and whatnot, but it was still super, super important. That was my job.
Sure.
What can we learn? What could I have learned? Or what kind of footballer, or anyone that in various different sports, which is not particularly a jumping sport, but requires jumping, what can we learn from the kind of insights that you get from these basketball beasts?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I would say, football is interesting in its own right, and I think some of it goes back to what we were speaking about earlier on in our conversation, where there are some links you can make from jump testing to accelerative or decelerative properties, or things that you're going to have to perform on pitch, right? Big accelerations, big decelerations. There are links that you'd probably lean into there. So if I'm a practitioner, I think there are, there's good information to be taken from the jump test that we can at least associate a plausible mechanism for some application behind what we're going to do in a training environment. But I would say football is one of the more interesting sports out there. Not to totally latch onto that and dive in here, but I think just before COVID, we did a little like a very small pilot project with the folks from the DFB, the German national team, but with some of their kind of like younger, it was U15, U16. So sent all of our equipment out to them and assessed, I think, it was for some camp they had with their under 15, under 16 national team. And I think, ultimately, right, the thing that got to be very interesting, right, they have a very distinctive playing style or responsibilities for each position on the pitch. And so ultimately being able to map things from an in-lab assessment to qualities that are going to be valued on the pitch, I think is a very, interesting question to try and tackle, right? It's where maybe, force plate or motion capture studies can step maybe just beyond a training environment, right? There's data for action, but then there's data for insight as well. And when you're trying to identify if a player has the tools for a job, right, if he's going to be able to tap into the velocities that he needs to be a wide player, or if he's going to be like you and just be a central defender, being a lump and, heading balls away. I think, those are, I think those are qualities that you can tap into on the biomechanics side that will start to inform some of the decision-making process in that direction. So unfortunately, I think that that COVID sort of nipped that project in the bud a little prematurely, but I still think there's some real value to even just from a plausible mechanism perspective, understanding how qualities that you assess in a biomechanics environment have implications for actions that occur on court, on pitch, wherever.
So in terms of the German national team youngsters, they were providing, or they were saying, okay, wingers, they have a particular set of skills. These are them. We need to assess them in a lab-based setting with force plates and motion capture. And that was up to you to devise the test that was going to try to inform whether they were in a position to be able to do that or not.
Yeah, and I think that was the basic premise. That was the basic premise. I think. Wow, that's cool. Yeah, and it got, not to take this a direction where we don't need to go, but of course. When it comes to we're talking a bit about kind of some cluster analysis. We did it with the counter movement jump paper. When we start to think about different ways that we can sort of group athletes, again, I think that has maybe less, it's maybe less actionable, but can be fairly insightful, right? It's a really, clustering, for those who don't know, it's an unsupervised machine learning technique, which just means that there objectively is no right answer, right? The right answer is whatever you think kind of fits your data the best, but it kind of gives you the ability to match, or kind of match the coach's eye with a more technical quantitative process, which together can be pretty powerful, right? If you can bring, folks on both sides of the table together in that sense, it can be a pretty powerful tool. And ultimately we were, what the goal was with this sort of project was to see, can we identify groups of athletes here with respect to, with the goal of kind of optimizing talent identification, right? Or,
Okay.
not optimizing, improving, right?
Yeah.
Are there qualities that we should be studying for or developing at a younger age to hopefully hit on a higher number of prospects, ultimately breaking through to the senior team, which admittedly is a pretty small number, I think, for every country at this point.
Yeah, of course.
Just development is a tricky beast, but ultimately, right, the kind of that clustering concept of saying, hey, of these athletes that we assessed, you got kind of 4 distinct kind of groups of movers. What are the qualities that we can learn from these guys, or what do you see from these guys on field that might shed a little more light on what we're seeing from these athletes?
Interesting. My last question on the testing side of things.
Yep.
Favorite funny, memorable moments from testing some of the best jumpers in the world?
Gosh, I'm going to start with a really corny answer and just say it's, working with really impressive athletes isn't something, that shine doesn't ever really go away. Yeah. Right. when you see some athletes move, right. And especially when you see some guys just, fight gravity like they do, it still takes your breath away. And in that sense, it's always been kind of very rewarding. At the same time, I don't know. I think a reason that we're all drawn to sport to some respect are just the personalities, right? And we're dealing with the 1% of the 1% with respect to what a human body can do. And it's always really fun in that regard. So, I think that's kind of where I would start. But yeah, that's cool. As far as, more specifics are concerned, let's see.
I've put it on the spot.
Gosh, look, I'm going to have to think of a good answer, or someone's going to have to chime in and let me know which one I should have remembered.
No, that's fine.
But no, I think, I think that's probably where I leave it. Also, if you want to cut that part, feel free. No, that's fine. I just completely bottled that one.
No, that's fine. Not a problem. I dropped that on you there. So let's move into the training side of things. And you mentioned throughout this around movement strategy. And I wanted to try to understand from you, when you get to know what strategies and grouping these strategies, how training is affected based on those, and if it actually is.
Yeah. So the short answer is that it is. Yeah. It certainly is. I think when we go through our assessment, the general process, right? When an athlete comes to one of our facilities, whether it's out in Santa Barbara or here in Atlanta, when an athlete goes through that process, day one, they spend hour and a half to 2 hours with myself or someone else on our team, arguably the worst 2 hours of their life, right? Just hanging out with us for 90 minutes or more, right? Going through their assessment, everything from injury history and mobility screen information, just simple range of motion through the ankles, through the hip, etc. All the way through kind of their full sort of 3D motion capture assessment as well. And so ultimately at the end of the day, here we go. The goal is to have a very detailed understanding of this athlete's mechanical makeup. And the way that we've gone through and done that at P3 is it started with a conversation with our coaches about identifying a needs list or a set of training targets for all of our athletes, right? So we have a set of training targets that I think essentially that we've identified over the course of the last 12 since before I joined P3, frankly. That our job on the biomechanics staff has been to really ascribe quantitative data that we can put to each of these particular targets, right? Whether that's hip stability or ankle mobility or active deceleration, right? Like an ankle stiffness property. So our job has been to go through and identify which markers we can, from our motion capture and force plate testing, we can use to essentially monitor each of these targets, right? And by virtue of testing as many athletes as we have, I think we just crossed 1,300 professional basketball players, and in a number of other sports as well. By kind of going through this process for as long as we have, you start to get some contextual understanding of what good, bad, and average is. And so when we start with this understanding, when the data comes back to us following an assessment, ultimately what we're able to do is say, these are the kind of 4 areas where this athlete falls notably below, the mean or below where we'd like to see them relative to other athletes in their sport or in their position. And to that end, these are going to be the training targets that fall out of it. And, kind of by virtue of taking that approach, that was also a very long-winded answer. I apologize. By virtue of taking that approach, what we can start to do is, if we're saying, hey, these are the 4 kind of like real critical targets we want to address over this next training block, we can follow those, by the time we go through that next reassessment, which, depending on how long the athlete's with us, we'd like to give 6 to 8 weeks at least to let some adaptation take place before we reassess and see how we've moved the needle on those properties. But our coaches have done a really good job of trying to close that loop, right? Go from this assessment data where we're essentially saying, hey, here are the qualities that we think need some work, and ultimately kind of testing and tinkering with strategies to try and address those specific targets before we retest the athlete. And so that's been very much a team effort, right, at P3 to try and really close the loop on how we're, I guess, assessing and then sort of impacting an athlete's development.
Across the 1,300 or however many tests that you've done, or athletes you've tested, is it easy to bucket these into put these into certain categories? If so, is there I know this is trying to simplify it, sorry.
No.
Into like we can dumb these down to 4 areas, so that at least we can say, okay, this guy or this girl we think fits in this bucket. Normally, this is the strategy we'd go to based on their movement strategy. Yep. And then obviously individual tweaks happen. But is that able to be done?
So it is. I would say, in general, our approach is to take a little more, or is to apply a little more specificity to it. So we try, I think, for the athletes who are training with us, we try and avoid bucketing. We try and have, it's kind of an own, each athlete gets their own individualized workout for each day. And our coaches do a really good job of making sure that they're, kind of staying on top of updating these programs as we go. So the short version is, for the athletes who are training with us in-house, whether you're a pro or an amateur, you kind of have your own specifically individualized workout each day. And by virtue of being a private facility and operating as we do, that's something that we're able to, it's something that we're able to put in place. But when we do work with teams, like we do have some collegiate teams or some other teams who come in and see us for a block, and this is probably something a problem that a number of folks have tried to tackle to this point. When you're dealing with a kind of a team schedule, that bucketing approach is the one that we try and go to. So it'll still go through that same assessment, but we'll try and essentially cluster the needs for all the athletes who go through the assessments. We can say, we've got our again, making this up, hip stability and ankle stiffness group. We've got our hamstring mobility and whatever other group. It's something we can start to apply a bit more specificity, without marching all the way down that kind of individualized direction, which admittedly is very tough to administer on a team-wide level.
So when it comes to movement strategy for counter movement jump, for example, you mentioned right at the start, getting vertical displacement from more hip flexion. When you're looking at them kind of movement strategies for a counter movement jump, I don't know if you've got an example in your head. I'm just wanting to try and get from, okay, this person's that type of jumper, therefore the training may look a little bit more like this, or that jumper's in this area and therefore this changes a little bit.
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yes. So I think that's the right premise. I will also preface this by saying I'm probably the wrong person to ask that to. Yeah. Just to shout them out real quick, John Flake and Jack Anderson are our coaches in Santa Barbara, and they do a fantastic job of, again, just applying that process to how we go through our training. And I think we want to be as diligent, detailed in collecting the data that we do, and these guys do. They do a great job when it comes to like applying their S&C know-how to that information. And I think collectively as a group, we're trying to tighten the screw on how we can understand how each of these individual parameters can change with training. But for the specifics of that answer, I would defer to them. They are they're going to be the source there. Okay,
sweet, like it. So when it comes to, I've put in there, I'll read out what I actually put in the notes. Training athletes who require lateral excellence, and that was obviously based on reading your some of your work, going through P3 stuff, but also links back to what you said before around obviously differences in metrics if we're looking for vertical or we're looking for lateral.
Yep.
So how is, I know you may defer back to the guys again, and please feel free to do that, but how does training differ when it comes to vertical versus lateral? I know I've gone to the testing, but training will be cool.
Sure. I can talk to it, or I can speak to it, topically, I suppose. I think kind of going back to an interpretation of our findings from that research, right? We would say, generally there are kind of more knee dominant parameters that tend to impact our vertical plane aptitude. Then there are some more hip dominant parameters that, have a greater impact on our lateral movement ability. And so to that end, if we're taking a basketball prospect and we, see that they struggle in one area but excel in another, really what we'll start to do is tinker with some of the ways that we're going to load them up. So we'll think about, for an athlete who struggles laterally, we'll think about maybe a slightly heavier dose of maybe, hinge oriented or hip dominant movements, as opposed to an athlete who struggles vertically, where we might tip the balance a little bit more in favor of some kind of more knee dominant work as well for them. Yep. Now that's also if all we're thinking about is optimizing lateral movement or jump height, when of course we want to take into account everything else, right? On any other training targets that they possess. But generally speaking, those are the ways that we'd start to tinker with an athlete's program when they come through, to try and hone in on kind of shoring up that deficit.
Cool, excellent.
Did that answer it at all?
Does. No, I 100% did.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nailed it. Cool. No need to defer. No need to. Right, I'm going to see us out for like next 10 minutes. And I think this would be really interesting coming from you and your background and the kind of organization that you're a part of. And this is the future of sports science. So where sports science is going in the future, obviously we've talked about a minuscule piece of that, moving from marker system and 3D motion capture system to markerless. And that's obviously just talking about technology. So
sure,
I'd love to get your take on the future of sports science and the future of sports science when it comes to tech.
That's a big topic.
Absolutely.
And 10 minutes, you said?
We can push to 12.
All right, we'll see how we do. So in general, I would say, where sports science is going is probably in an effort to blur the line between what happens in the lab and what happens on the field or court, right? I think already in baseball, right, in MLB, and also in the NBA, you're seeing optical tracking systems, right, start to, be installed in stadiums. And these are systems that can start to give you a lot of the same information without making judgment on the quality of the data yet, but they're going to give you the same sort of information that you can get from a gold standard 3D motion capture lab, anywhere in the world. So ultimately, I think, right, because optical tracking is going to be, play a much more, central role in it's going to occupy a lot of the data, a lot of the data that teams are going to start collecting. I think we're really going to see a trend pushed in that direction, right? I think now there are still a series of questions that needs to be asked in the way of accuracy of those systems, but I don't see the accuracy getting any worse. If anything, they're going to continually get get better, right? With that comes a whole different set of considerations, right? Things like how you classify what movements are actually being conducted, on field. When we study a jump, we know it's a CMJ or we know it's a depth jump. We know what it is, right? When we start to think about actions that happen on court, I think that clarity goes out the window a little bit, just because the nature of sport is so kind of fluid and dynamic. But I think really you're going to start to see the lines start to blur between things that happen in the lab and things that happen on court.
Yeah. I was actually having a discussion today, or little chat today, with someone around LiDAR. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you've come across? And
I taught like a bit, okay. No experience with it, but I mean, in concept, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Is that something that you see? The only reason I mention it is because the guy I've spoken to was going to go through a reliability study with a particular company who are actually in organizations now, but kind of keeping things on the slow down because of that. So it was just to get your take on whether it was going to be something that was going to be more shouted about, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think we're probably going to go through a phase where there's a lot of experimentation with different means of collecting the same or similar data, but all sort of focused on actions that happen on court, right? A few years ago, the NBA, installed, second spectrum, or, just had cameras installed to be able to track, slightly more in depth on court stats. And I think the next progression, again, is some of this skeletal modeling that we're starting to see. But whether it's that or LiDAR, I think ultimately we're going to start to see a number of efforts to start to quantify actions that occur on court, and some not too dissimilar from how, again, GPS tracking exploded once upon a time. Now, I think the next question off that, it's one thing to be able to collect a lot of data. It's another thing to figure it out and understand it. And I think that's where the groups or the teams that can really understand that information first, are definitely going to win the first few battles, right? As for the war, who knows at this point? It's too early to call, but I think we're probably in for a bit of a wild ride with respect to just the sheer kind of volume of options available to us.
Yeah. So from an organization who were very well known for jump testing and obviously using force plates to be able to do that, is there, not looking at alternatives, but is there what's the future of jump testing itself? Is it still force plates? Is it something else?
I think there are probably different steps that we can march along. I think first, for our kind of personal next steps, I think we're going to start to, our goals are to start to install technology with some of our team partners, right? So install force plates and motion capture in a manner where we can start to automate the processing and collection of a lot of that information, still in a lab setting, but with an eye toward using data that's collected in a lab to understand things on court, right? So when you see a jump on court, ultimately, can we relate that back to mechanics that we're seeing in a much more controlled, ideally more confound-free environment? So I think that's kind of our next step, is to try and facilitate kind of that more, granular biomechanical data collection in the performance space with some of our team partners. But beyond that, I think a lot of the real big steps with respect to jump testing are going to be finding ways to bleed those findings to what happens on court or on field or wherever it is that you're playing. So even this is very superficial, I would say, at this point. But even with the kind of the clusters that we identified for different counter movement jump strategy, what we started to do was overlay some parameters as it relates to performance on court. So whether that's block percentage, so percentage of shots that an athlete blocks while they're on the court, or rebound percentage, or kind of how an athlete performs during certain like time stress instances, you started to see some real significant differences between athletes in different clusters in these various performance categories, right? So not surprisingly, right, the athletes who didn't need to go through much range to be able to achieve a good jump height, those are the guys who tended to excel with respect to block rates or rebounding rates, things that ultimately are going to impact life on court, strengthening those connections, right, through kind of continued study. And then, again, the explosion in on-court tracking, I think is going to be, really important next few steps for us.
And I guess them kind of links that you mentioned at the start there are the ones that are going to get the coaches super, super interested.
I mean, that's the hope, right? That's the hope. I think, they're like, look, strength work and training athletes is supremely valuable. And I don't think anyone who at least who listens to this podcast would argue otherwise. But, the extent to which, we can all start to show some additional value beyond the weight room or beyond the gym and impact things that are going to be important to position coaches, whether that's certain responsibilities that an athlete's going to have on court, or whether that's, kind of certain performance outcomes, or, kind of various like injury outcomes as well. The more that we can start to draw links between what happens in the gym or in the lab and things that happen on court, I think the better we're all going to be, better we'll all be for it.
Here. Right. I'm going to ask you where people can find out more about the work that you do at P3. I know you seem slightly embarrassed about your Twitter account. So I'm going to ask you about your Twitter account. What your Twitter account, P3, where can people find out what you've got going on?
Sure. My Twitter handle is at Leidersdorf, my last name, which, not the easiest last name in the world, but, you can only work with what you're given. So, I think it was a resolution for 2022 to be a bit more active on Twitter. Have not done that one well. So, maybe 2023 is maybe that's the year.
The year.
I think so. We'll see. But so that's for myself. And then, for P3, at P3 Sports Science, is where you can find sort of our company's handle at that point. And, not to take this as an opportunity to sort of plug the rest of the team, but we've got a really fantastic group that we're working with right now. And I think they're all kind of worth a shout, whether it's on Twitter or on social. Really thoughtful group, really smart, some guys kind of bleeding the line between biomechanics and coaching as well. So we've got a great team between, John and Jack, who I mentioned, Trent Reeves and Jake Roush on the biomechanics team in Santa Barbara, Leah Borkin here in Atlanta. We've got a really strong group in that regard. So, I also want to make sure they get their due here, not to drag this on too late.
No, absolutely not. 100%. Thank you for that. Right, Eric, I'm going to let you go, but thank you very much for the last hour. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your openness and your insights, and look forward to keeping in touch and chatting to you soon.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Cheers, Eric.
Awesome. Thanks.